In hushed university halls and across the sun-scorched landscapes of the Middle East, a quiet but persistent argument simmers, a debate that touches the very first chapter of our collective human story. It's a controversy that asks a seemingly simple question: who got there first? Who can truly claim the title of the oldest civilization on Earth? For generations, the answer was straightforward, a fact learned by school children and printed in textbooks with unwavering certainty. But the Earth, it seems, is always willing to give up new secrets, and with every discovery, the clean lines of history become wonderfully, fascinatingly blurred. The claim to being first is a crown sought by many ancient peoples, and modern scholars are the detectives trying to piece together a puzzle with most of its pieces still missing. It's a title that shifts with every new carbon dating result, every unearthed tablet, every reevaluation of what it even means to be civilized. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as our story tonight will span the entire globe and the depths of time, I'd love to see how far it's reaching. Feel free to leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet thrill to think of this shared story echoing in different corners of the world, a thread connecting us all in the stillness of the night. The heart of this great historical debate lies in another deceptively simple question. What, precisely, is a civilization? It's a word we use freely, but the checklist historians use is quite specific. It isn't enough to simply have a group of people living together. To earn the title, a culture must demonstrate certain key traits. First, there must be cities, not just villages, but large, organized urban centers that serve as hubs for trade, politics, and culture. With cities comes the need for complex institutions, like organized government to manage the population and an established religion to explain the unexplainable. There must be a division of labor where people can specialize in tasks beyond farming, becoming artisans, priests, soldiers, and scribes. This is often accompanied by monumental architecture, structures built not just for shelter, but for prestige and worship. And perhaps, most critically, there is the matter of writing, the ability to keep records, to transmit knowledge and tell stories through a symbolic system is often considered the final, definitive marker, the line separating history from prehistory. For a long time, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers in modern-day Iraq, held the title uncontested. Its Sumerian people gave us Uruk, the first true city. They gave us Cuneiform, the first true writing system. But then, as archaeologists dug deeper, other contenders began to emerge from the sand and silt. To the southwest, along the predictable, life-giving banks of the Nile, ancient Egypt arose. Its claim is formidable, with its god-kings, its hieroglyphs, and its pyramids that defy the imagination even today. Some of its earliest unified kingdoms appear to be almost exactly contemporary with the first cities of Sumer. Could they have been first? Or perhaps they were second, but shone so brightly that their light obscures the timeline. Further east, another candidate emerged from the soil of Pakistan and India, the Indus Valley civilization. Here were cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, laid out on astonishingly precise grids, complete with advanced plumbing and sewer systems that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. They had a system of trade that stretched for hundreds of miles and their own unique script, which remains tantalizingly undeciphered to this day. Their quiet, orderly sophistication presents a powerful case. And what of China, where civilization coalesced along the Yellow River, or the Norte Chico civilization in Peru, building pyramid-like structures in the same era? Each culture seems to have reached that critical threshold of complexity almost simultaneously, a flowering of human ingenuity in disparate parts of the world. But the most profound challenge to the timeline comes from a place that is not a city at all. High on a barren plateau in modern-day Turkey sits Göbekli Tepe. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most astonishing archaeological finds in history. Here, more than 11,000 years ago, a staggering 6,000 years before Stonehenge or the Great Pyramid, nomadic hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet invented pottery or domesticated animals, somehow organized themselves to carve and erect massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons. These pillars are adorned with intricate carvings of animals, foxes, lions, snakes, and vultures. This was not a settlement. It was a temple, a ritual center on an unbelievable scale. This discovery presents a profound historical mystery. The old theory was that agriculture led to settlements, which in turn allowed for complex religion and monumental building. Yet Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. Could it be that the intense, shared belief required to build such a structure was the very catalyst that compelled people to settle down, to develop agriculture simply to feed the workers at their sacred site? Was the temple the cause of the city and not the other way around? It forces us to reconsider our neat checklist. Göbekli Tepe had monumental architecture and complex social organization, but no writing, no pottery, and no city life as we define it. Is it a civilization or something else, a precursor that rewrites the entire first chapter? For now, it remains a beautiful enigma. And so, while acknowledging the incredible achievements of Egypt, the Indus Valley, and the profound questions raised by Göbekli Tepe, our story tonight will focus on the land where all the required pieces of the puzzle first clicked into place in a single, unbroken sequence. We journey to that sun-baked plain nestled between two legendary rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is Mesopotamia, a Greek name meaning the land between the rivers. It was here, in the southern region known as Sumer, that the first cities were born, the first laws were written, the first empires were forged, and the story of history as we know it truly began. It lacked the stone of Egypt and the predictable floods of the Nile, but its challenging environment would prove to be not a hindrance, but the very crucible of innovation. This land, at first glance, does not seem like a cradle. It appears more like an anvil, a harsh, flat expanse of earth, relentlessly beaten by a hammer of sun. To the north and east, the Zagros Mountains rise like a jagged wall, and to the west lies the vast furnace of the Syrian and Arabian deserts. There is no stone here for building, no great forests for timber. For much of the year, the landscape is a parched, dusty brown, cracked by the heat. The air can be so thick with dust that the sun becomes a pale, hazy disk in a white sky. It is a place of extremes, and its two life-giving arteries, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, were not gentle benefactors like the Nile. The Nile's flood was a predictable, welcome guest, arriving each year almost to the day, laying down its rich black silt and receding gracefully. The Tigris and Euphrates were wild, untamable beasts. Fed by the melting snows of the mountains in what is now Turkey, their floods were sudden, violent, and catastrophically unpredictable, capable of wiping out a season's crops and entire settlements in a single roaring deluge. And yet, it was precisely this challenge, this lack of easy comfort, that appears to have forced the hand of genius. In a land of effortless bounty, innovation can stagnate. But here in southern Mesopotamia, survival was an active, relentless struggle that demanded cooperation on an unprecedented scale. It was a problem that no single family or even a small clan could solve alone. The problem was water. There was either far too much of it all at once, or not nearly enough for the long, blistering months of summer. The solution, developed slowly over countless generations, would be the foundational technology of civilization itself: irrigation. The people who settled this plain realized they could not simply live beside the rivers. They had to learn to manage them, to tame them. They began to dig. With little more than reed baskets, stone hoes, and their own bare hands, they began to construct a network of artificial waterways. Imagine the scene: a community of people, hundreds strong, working under the oppressive sun. They dig a small channel leading from the riverbank, guiding a trickle of precious water toward a thirsty field of barley. Over time, that simple ditch becomes a canal, several feet deep and miles long. They build dikes of packed earth and reeds to protect their fields from the spring floods, and construct reservoirs to store the floodwater for use during the dry season. This was more than just farming. This was landscape engineering on a monumental scale. This intricate web of canals, channels, and dikes became the true source of life and wealth. The silt carried by the rivers, a fine, rich alluvium, was some of the most fertile soil on the planet. Once watered and cultivated, it could yield astonishing agricultural surpluses, producing more grain than the farmers needed to feed their own families. This surplus was the key. It was the economic engine that powered everything to come. For the first time in human history, a society could produce enough food to support a significant number of people who did not have to farm. This is the moment when the potter, the weaver, the metalworker, and the priest can exist as full-time specialists. A portion of every harvest could be set aside, stored in communal granaries, likely controlled by the community's nascent religious authorities. This stored wealth could then be used to pay for labor on public works, like digging new canals or building a larger temple. It could also be used for trade, exchanged with people in the mountains for the timber, stone, and metals that Sumer itself so desperately lacked. The very act of creating and maintaining this hydraulic system fundamentally reshaped society. A family could manage a field, but a canal system required central planning and coordination. Who decides where a new canal should be dug? Who organizes the labor force to clean the silt that inevitably clogs the channels? And most importantly, who gets how much water and when? These are not questions that can be solved by informal agreement. They require authority. This need for management is likely where the first true governments were born. Perhaps it was the priests, acting as intermediaries for the water gods, who first directed these efforts from their growing temples. They tracked the seasons, interpreted the omens, and collected a share of the harvest in the god's name. In doing so, they became the first administrators, the first bureaucrats. This idea is sometimes called the hydraulic empire theory, the hypothesis that the state was born out of the necessity of managing large-scale water projects. While it is still debated by historians, it provides a powerful explanation for why a centralized, hierarchical society emerged so robustly in this particular environment. Controlling the water meant controlling the food supply, and controlling the food supply meant controlling the people. It was a system that demanded obedience and collective effort, but the rewards were survival and eventually a level of prosperity the world had never before seen. The inhospitable plain was slowly being transformed into a patchwork of verdant green, a man-made Eden carved out of the dust. But to understand the minds of the people who would one day build these canals and raise these temples, we must drift even further back, before the first irrigation ditch was ever dug, to a time when the very idea of a permanent home was alien to the human experience. For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity had lived a different life, a nomadic one, scattered across the continents in small, restless bands. Life was a constant journey, dictated by the movement of wild herds and the seasonal ripening of plants. A home was a temporary cave or a simple shelter of branches, easily abandoned when the deer moved on or the berry bushes were picked clean. These hunter-gatherers were masters of their environment, possessing a deep, intuitive knowledge of the natural world that we can now only guess at. They knew the tracks of every animal, the properties of every plant, the omens in the clouds, and the patterns of the stars. Their world was one of immediate and intense sensation, a life of profound freedom, but also one of profound precarity, lived perpetually on the edge of starvation. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something began to change. It wasn't a sudden event, not a war or a single invention, but a slow, quiet, and irreversible transformation that has been called the Neolithic Revolution. It was arguably the most significant shift in the entire course of human history, and it began with a simple observation. Perhaps it was a woman, tasked with gathering wild grasses, who noticed that some of the seeds she spilled near the campsite a year prior had sprouted into a new patch of grain. Perhaps a hunter, having cornered a herd of wild sheep in a narrow canyon, realized it was easier to keep them there and kill them one by one than to constantly search for new prey. The exact origins are lost to time, but the process was a gradual shift from merely taking what nature provided to actively shaping nature to suit human needs. This was the birth of agriculture. Instead of wandering to find wild wheat and barley, people began to intentionally plant the seeds in promising locations, often in the fertile floodplains of rivers. They learned to save the best seeds from each harvest, slowly over many generations, breeding the wild grasses into the more plump and nutritious cereals we know today. At the same time, they began to tame the animal world. Instead of hunting the wild aurochs, the ancestor of modern cattle, they captured calves and raised them. They corralled herds of wild goats and sheep, breeding the most placid and useful animals for their meat, milk, and wool. This two-pronged revolution, the domestication of plants and animals, fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with the earth. It offered a tantalizing promise, a stable and potentially abundant food source. But this promise came at a cost, and that cost was freedom of movement. A planted field is an anchor. It cannot be abandoned. It must be tended, weeded, protected from animals, and eventually harvested. The newly domesticated herds also needed to be managed and protected. And so, for the first time, people began to settle down. The wandering bands gave way to permanent villages. In the region of Mesopotamia, these early settlers are known as the Ubaid culture, the direct ancestors of the Sumerians. They built simple, multi-roomed houses out of mud brick and clustered them together for protection and community. They made a distinctive style of pottery and, crucially, built the very first temples, small, modest structures that would become the blueprint for the great ziggurats to come. This new, settled life created a cascade of changes. Living in one place allowed for the accumulation of possessions in a way that was impossible for a nomad. Pottery could be used for storing grain and water. Weaving provided more sophisticated textiles, but it also brought new problems. Living in close quarters with both neighbors and animals led to new sanitation issues and the spread of diseases. A single bad harvest, a drought, or a flood could be devastating for an entire community that was now tethered to a single location. Some historians even question whether this shift was a clear improvement for the average person. Archaeological evidence suggests that early farmers were often smaller, less healthy, and worked far longer and harder hours than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, who enjoyed a more varied diet and more leisure time. It seems the agricultural revolution was a trade-off. Individual health and freedom may have declined, but the community as a whole could support a much larger population. It was a bargain made with the future, sacrificing the quality of life for a few in one generation for the quantity of lives in the generations to come. Most importantly, this new way of life forged a new way of thinking. The hunter's mind is attuned to the present moment, to the immediate opportunity. The farmer's mind must be oriented toward the future. They must think in cycles, in seasons, planning months in advance. They must have the discipline to save a portion of their precious harvest, not for eating, but for planting next year. They must have the patience to toil for a reward they will not see for many months. It is this mindset, this ability to engage in long-term planning, to defer gratification, and to cooperate on communal tasks for a future benefit, that was the essential psychological foundation upon which all of civilization would be built. It was the human software that would eventually be capable of running the complex hardware of irrigation, cities, and states. This new way of living, anchored to the fertile, irrigated earth, created a gravitational pull. The small, scattered villages of the Ubaid culture began to grow and then to merge. As agricultural techniques became more efficient, a single plot of land could produce more food than ever before, supporting a larger and denser population. Over the course of several centuries, a few of these settlements swelled from large villages into the world's first towns, and then one in particular outpaced them all, undergoing a kind of social supernova. It expanded with breathtaking speed, drawing in people from the surrounding countryside and becoming a sprawling, vibrant, and chaotic organism, unlike anything the world had ever seen before. This was Uruk, nestled in the southern Mesopotamian plain, in the heartland of what would become Sumer. Uruk was the tipping point. Around 3200 BCE, at its peak, it was a true metropolis. Estimates of its population range from 50 to 80,000 people, a concentration of humanity that was simply unprecedented. To walk its streets was to witness a new stage in the human experiment. The city was encased in a massive defensive wall of baked brick, nearly 6 miles in circumference, a legendary feat of engineering later attributed to its most famous mythical king, Gilgamesh. This wall alone, a clear line drawn in the sand, separating the city from the wildness of the outside world, was a statement. It spoke of wealth worth protecting and of enemies to be feared. Let us imagine passing through one of its great gates. The immediate sensation would be one of overwhelming activity. The quiet, predictable rhythms of village life would be shattered by the clamor of thousands of people. The streets are narrow, unpaved, and winding, more like alleyways, twisting between rows of tightly packed, windowless houses made of sun-dried mud brick. The air is thick with the smell of cooking fires, of dust, of the livestock being led to the temple for sacrifice, and the sharp scent of the potter's kiln. You would hear the constant murmur of voices in a language we now know as Sumerian, the bleating of sheep in a central pen, the rhythmic hammering from a coppersmith's workshop, and perhaps, drifting from the city's heart, the sound of priestly chanting. This was the first time in history that a person could be surrounded by thousands of complete strangers, a profoundly new and perhaps unsettling social reality. At the center of this human beehive, rising high above the single-story dwellings, were the true hearts of the city, the great temple complexes. Uruk had 2 major sacred precincts. One was dedicated to Anu, the god of the sky, and the other, the sprawling Eanna district, was consecrated to Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and war. These were not simple places of worship. They were the economic and administrative engines of the entire city-state. The temples were the largest landowners, controlling vast tracts of irrigated farmland in the countryside. They operated enormous workshops where artisans wove textiles, crafted pottery, and forged tools. They were, in essence, massive, divinely sanctioned corporations, collecting agricultural surplus, barley, dates, sesame oil, as offerings, and redistributing them as rations and wages to the thousands of priests, scribes, soldiers, and laborers in their employ. This complex system of collection and redistribution was the foundation of the Sumerian economy, and it created a distinct social hierarchy, with the high priest and his administrators at the very top, and the common laborers at the bottom. This explosive growth and organization was so successful that it spilled beyond the city walls. In one of the great mysteries of archaeology, artifacts and architectural styles from Uruk began to appear across the ancient Near East during this period. From Syria and Turkey to the highlands of Iran, archaeologists have found sites with Uruk-style pottery, cylinder seals, and even entire settlements that look like colonial outposts. What was driving this Uruk expansion? Was it the world's first empire, with the rulers of Uruk sending out governors and soldiers to conquer new territory? Was it a network of commercial trading posts, established to secure access to vital raw materials like timber, stone, and copper that were absent in southern Mesopotamia? Or was it simply the power of a successful idea, with surrounding cultures willingly adopting the advanced administrative techniques and cultural prestige of the world's first and greatest city? Historians still debate the true nature of this expansion, but it's clear that Uruk's influence was immense. It was the New York, London, and Rome of its day, a cultural and economic center whose innovations were being copied and adopted for hundreds of miles in every direction. The city was a new kind of beast, and this beast, with its complex economy and vast administration, was beginning to strain the limits of human memory. A temple official couldn't simply remember how many thousands of sheep were received and how many bushels of barley were paid out. A new tool was needed to manage this new complexity, a tool that would change the world forever. The great temple storerooms of Uruk were a testament to the city's wealth, but for the scribes and priests who managed them, they were a logistical nightmare. Imagine the scene: a vast, dim chamber filled with thousands of clay pots of barley, jars of sesame oil, and stacks of wool fleeces. Outside in the temple courtyards, countless sheep and cattle are being delivered as offerings to the goddess Inanna. All of this wealth has to be tracked. Every contribution from every farmer, every wage paid to every temple worker, every transaction with a visiting merchant, it all had to be accounted for. But how? Human memory, for all its wonders, is notoriously fallible. A tired or dishonest administrator could easily misremember a number, leading to disputes that could unravel the city's delicate social fabric. The managers of Uruk needed a reliable external system to record information. They needed an extension for their brains. Their first solution was ingenious in its simplicity. They used small clay tokens of various shapes and sizes to represent different goods. A small cone-shaped token might represent 1 unit of barley. A sphere might be a larger measure. A flat disk with a cross on it could signify a sheep. To record a transaction, say, a farmer delivering 10 sheep to the temple, an administrator would count out 10 of the sheep tokens and seal them inside a hollow, baseball-sized ball of wet clay called a bulla. This bulla was then fired, creating a permanent, tamper-proof record of the delivery. If a dispute arose later, the bulla could be broken open and the tokens inside counted. It was a brilliant system of 3-dimensional accounting, but it had one major flaw. To verify the contents, you had to destroy the container. The next evolutionary step was a small one, but it contained the seed of a revolution. Before sealing the tokens inside the bulla, the scribes began to press the tokens into the soft clay on the outside, creating impressions of their shapes. A cone token would leave a conical mark. A disc would leave a circular one. Now anyone could read the outside of the bulla to know what was sealed inside without having to break it. And then, in a quiet moment of insight, in some forgotten bureaucratic office, a scribe had the final, world-altering realization. If the impressions on the outside perfectly represent the tokens on the inside, why do you need the tokens or the hollow ball at all? You could simply take a flattened piece of wet clay, a tablet, and press the symbols directly onto its surface. With that, the first true written document was born. Initially, the script was purely pictographic. The symbols were simplified drawings of the objects they represented. A wavy line meant water. A sketch of a head of barley meant barley. An outline of an ox's head meant ox. This proto-writing was incredibly useful for making lists and keeping ledgers, which is all it was designed for, but it was also incredibly limited. It was fine for nouns, for tangible things, but how do you draw an abstract concept like love or belief or payment due? As the script evolved, the scribes found that drawing realistic pictures in wet clay was slow and made the clay messy. They developed a new tool, a stylus cut from a reed, which had a triangular tip. Instead of drawing lines, they found it was much faster and neater to simply press the tip of the stylus into the clay, creating a crisp, wedge-shaped mark. By combining these wedges in different patterns, they could create any symbol they needed. This new script, a collection of wedge-shaped marks, is what we now call cuneiform, from the Latin word cunus, meaning wedge. The final and most important breakthrough was conceptual. It was the moment the scribes realized a symbol could represent not just an object, but a sound. This is known as the rebus principle. In English, it would be like drawing a picture of an eye, a can, a knot, and a C to write the sentence, "I cannot see." The Sumerians began to do the same. The Sumerian word for arrow was tai. As it happened, the word for life was also tai. So the cuneiform symbol for an arrow, which was easy to make, could now be used to write the abstract and profound concept of life. This was the key that unlocked the full potential of writing. It could now record the sounds of spoken language itself, complete with verbs, prepositions, and abstract ideas. Writing was no longer just a glorified accounting system. It could now be used to tell stories, to record laws, to write letters, and to preserve history. There was no single inventor, no one moment of discovery. The invention of writing was a slow, anonymous evolution over centuries, driven by the pragmatic needs of temple accountants in Uruk. The first poets and historians simply piggybacked on a technology created to keep track of sheep and grain. Yet its impact was absolute. With the invention of writing on a durable material like clay, knowledge was no longer tied to the fragile memory of a living person. It could be made permanent, it could be accumulated, built upon, and transmitted flawlessly across vast distances, and more importantly, across the chasm of time. The humble clay tablet was the world's first hard drive, and its creation marks the true beginning of history. Now, with the key of cuneiform in hand, we can unlock the very mind of the Sumerians. For the first time, we do not have to guess at what they believed based on statues or graves. We can read their own words, their stories, their prayers, and their myths. And the world that these clay tablets reveal is one that is saturated with the divine, a world where every gust of wind and every ripple of water was the direct result of a god's pass and whim. To a Sumerian, the universe was not governed by impersonal laws of nature, but by a vast and complex pantheon of powerful, immortal, and terrifyingly human-like deities. The gods of Sumer were not serene, all-knowing, or infinitely benevolent. They were anthropomorphic to an extreme degree. They loved and hated. They celebrated and schemed. They felt jealousy, rage, and regret. They were, in essence, superpowered humans, prone to all the same flaws and petty squabbles, but with the power to obliterate cities on a whim. This divine drama played out on a cosmic scale, and humanity's role in it was anything but glamorous. According to their creation myths, humans were not the pinnacle of a loving creation. They were an afterthought. The story goes that the younger gods were tasked by the elder gods with all the hard labor of maintaining the universe, which included digging the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Tired of the toil, the younger gods went on strike. To solve this labor dispute, the clever god of wisdom, Enki, came up with a solution. He would create a new, lesser race of beings specifically to take over the burdensome work. And so, humanity was fashioned from clay, a race of servants whose sole purpose was to feed, clothe, and house the gods, to maintain their temples, and to dig their canals so that the divine beings could relax and enjoy their immortal lives. This fundamental belief shaped the entire Sumerian worldview. Life was not a gift to be enjoyed for its own sake. It was a sentence of hard labor, a constant act of service to a pantheon of demanding and often ungrateful masters. At the head of this pantheon was a council of powerful deities. The supreme authority was An, the Sky Father, though he often remained a distant and remote figure, like a celestial chairman of the board. The real power on earth was wielded by his son, Enlil, the god of wind, air, and storms. Enlil was the enforcer of the divine will, a stern and wrathful figure who was deeply respected but rarely loved. It was he who granted kings their authority, but he could also be the source of devastating floods and plagues when humanity's noise began to annoy him. A counterbalance to Enlil's harshness was often found in the god Enki, the lord of the abyss, the fresh water that flowed in the rivers and canals. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, and craftsmanship. He was often portrayed as a cunning trickster, and more importantly, as a friend to humanity, sometimes intervening to soften Enlil's cruelest decrees or to share divine secrets with his mortal servants. Perhaps the most beloved and feared of all was the goddess Inanna, the patron deity of Uruk. She was a goddess of dizzying contradictions, the goddess of sensual love and beauty, but also the goddess of brutal, bloody warfare. She could be a source of immense fertility and bountiful harvests, but her passion could also be destructive and vengeful. Her myths depict her as ambitious, brilliant, and utterly relentless in getting what she wanted, whether it was a control over more divine domains or a handsome mortal lover. These were the forces that the average Sumerian believed governed their world. A good crop was a sign of Inanna's favor. A sudden storm was the fury of Enlil. Success in a craft was a gift from Enki. Life was a constant negotiation with these invisible superhuman forces. This negotiation extended even beyond death, though what lay beyond was not a comforting thought. The Sumerian afterlife was not a place of heavenly reward or infernal punishment. All mortals, whether king or commoner, good or evil, went to the same destination, a gloomy, subterranean realm known as the Land of No Return. It was a bleak, dusty, and silent underworld where the shades of the dead flitted about like bats, eating clay and drinking muddy water for eternity. This pessimistic view of the afterlife placed an enormous importance on the present life. Your only hope for a kind of immortality was to be remembered on earth, either by having children who would continue to make offerings in your name, or by achieving such great fame that your story would be told for generations. This deep-seated fear of the gods' wrath is perfectly captured in their great flood myth, a story that predates the biblical tale of Noah by more than a millennium. In the Sumerian version, the god Enlil, infuriated by the noise and clamor of humanity, decides to wipe them all out with a massive flood. But the ever-helpful god Enki secretly warns a pious king named Ziusudra, instructing him to build a giant boat and load it with his family and pairs of all living creatures. The flood comes, a terrifying deluge that rages for 7 days and 7 nights, and all of humanity is destroyed, save for Ziusudra and those aboard his ark. The parallels to the later story in Genesis are stunning, and many scholars believe it to be the direct inspiration. But what was the origin of the Sumerian story? Archaeologists digging at ancient cities like Ur have discovered a thick, sterile layer of river silt dating to around 2900 BCE, evidence of a real, catastrophic flood that may have been so devastating that it was preserved in myth as a world-ending event. For the Sumerians, it was the ultimate proof that their gods were all-powerful and that their own existence was fragile, utterly dependent on the whims of the divine. The Sumerians believed their gods dwelt in the heavens, or on the distant mythical mountaintops at the edge of the world. Their divine masters were beings of the sky, the storm, and the celestial ether. But the land of Sumer itself was relentlessly, achingly flat. For as far as the eye could see, the world was a horizontal plane of earth, water, and reeds, stretching to a shimmering horizon. This geography presented a theological problem. How do you get the attention of gods who live so far above you? How do you invite them down from their celestial homes to partake in the sacrifices you've prepared, to hear your prayers, and to inhabit the city you have built in their honor? If nature did not provide a mountain to bridge the gap between the mortal and divine realms, then the people of Mesopotamia would have to build one themselves. And so they did. This was the origin and the essential purpose of the ziggurat. These immense structures, which came to dominate the skyline of every major Mesopotamian city, are often confused with the pyramids of Egypt, but their form and function were entirely different. A pyramid is a tomb, a sealed, such secret, final resting place for a king, with smooth, inaccessible sides designed to protect what lies within. A ziggurat was the opposite. It was a solid cord structure, built not of stone, but of millions upon millions of sun-dried mud bricks, with a protective outer skin of more durable, water-resistant baked bricks. It was not a tomb, but a tiered, stepped tower, a colossal staircase reaching for the heavens. All the important activity happened on the outside. Its purpose was to be climbed. It was an invitation, a visible, tangible link between the earth below and the sky above. The construction of a ziggurat was a monumental undertaking, often the defining public works project of a king's entire reign. It required a level of resource management and labor organization that only a powerful, centralized temple state could command. For decades, an army of workers would toil under the Mesopotamian sun, mixing river mud with straw to form the bricks, leaving them to bake in the heat, and then hauling them to the construction site. Slowly, layer by layer, the artificial mountain would rise from the plain. The core of sun-dried brick was reinforced with layers of reed matting and sealed with bitumen, a natural asphalt that oozed from the ground in parts of Mesopotamia, which acted as a waterproof mortar. To ascend a ziggurat, like the beautifully preserved one in the citadel of Ur, was to take a spiritual journey. One would approach a series of 3 massive, converging staircases, each with 100 steps. As you began to climb, the noise and bustle of the city, the markets, the workshops, the crowded residential quarters would begin to fade away below you. The air would grow clearer, the breeze cooler. The higher you climbed, the more the world of mortals receded, and the more you entered the vast, silent realm of the sky. The staircase was a path of transition, leading away from the profane and toward the sacred. At the very top, on the final highest platform, sat a small temple or shrine. This was the most sacred space in the entire city. It was believed to be the literal earthly dwelling place of the city's patron god, a celestial waiting room where the deity would descend to rest and receive their daily meals, which were dutifully carried up by the high priests. It was a space of immense privilege and mystery, accessible only to the most senior members of the priesthood, the sole intermediaries between the people and their god. From this summit, the view was breathtaking. The entire city-state would be laid out like a map. The intricate maze of streets, the thick defensive walls, and beyond them, the patchwork of green, irrigated fields and shimmering canals stretching to the horizon. The ziggurat was a symbol of the god's power, but it was also an undeniable symbol of the king's. It was the ultimate landmark, a declaration of wealth, stability, and piety that could be seen for miles across the flat plain. Its presence was a constant reminder to the populace of the divine and earthly order that governed their lives. It is almost certain that these towering Mesopotamian structures were the inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The story, told in the book of Genesis, describes a united humanity in the land of Shinar, the Hebrew name for Sumer, who begin to build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens to make a name for themselves. This act of hubris angers God, who then confuses their language and scatters them across the face of the earth. When the ancient Hebrews were held in captivity in Babylon in the 6th century BCE, they would have seen the city's colossal ziggurat, named Temenanki, which translates to the foundation of heaven and earth. To a captive people, this magnificent 7-story structure, rising nearly 300 feet into the air, could easily have been interpreted as the ultimate symbol of pagan arrogance, a cautionary tale of humanity trying to ascend to the level of the divine through its own efforts. The memory of this real brick mountain was likely transformed into the myth that has echoed through Western culture ever since. The ziggurats were the work of kings, physical testaments to their power and piety. But the greatest legacy a king could hope for was not made of sun-dried brick, but of words and memory. The most enduring monument of all was a good story, and it is from the city of Uruk, etched into clay tablets, that we find the world's first great work of literature, the world's first epic hero, a king named Gilgamesh. His story, a sprawling tale of friendship, grief, and a desperate search for immortality, is not just a foundational myth. It is a profound window into the Sumerian soul, revealing what they valued, what they feared, and how they made sense of their place in the universe. The epic begins by introducing its hero, Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. He is a figure of immense power and privilege, described as being 2/3 god and 1/3 man. He is handsome, courageous, and stronger than any other mortal. But he is also a terrible tyrant. Drunk on his own power, he abuses his people, working the men to death on his great city walls and claiming his right as king to sleep with every new bride on her wedding night before her husband. The people of Uruk, suffering under his oppressive rule, cry out to the gods for help. In response, the gods decide not to destroy Gilgamesh, but to create a counterbalance for him, a companion who can match his strength and temper his arrogance. They create Enkidu, a wild man born in the wilderness. Enkidu is the mirror opposite of the urban Gilgamesh. He is covered in hair, lives among the animals, eats grass, and knows nothing of civilization. His transition from wildness to civilization is one of the story's most fascinating parts. A trapper, frustrated that Enkidu is freeing animals from his traps, arranges for a temple priestess, Shamhat, to meet him at a watering hole. She seduces Enkidu, and after spending a week with her, he finds that the wild animals no longer accept him. He has acquired the scent and the wisdom of humanity. Shamhat then leads him to Uruk, teaching him to eat bread and drink beer, the staples of civilized life. When they arrive, Gilgamesh is about to claim his due from a new bride. But Enkidu, outraged by this injustice, blocks his path. The two titans clash, wrestling fiercely in the city streets. The fight shakes the very foundations of the temple, but neither can defeat the other. In this moment of perfect stalemate, they recognize each other as equals. Their rage dissolves into mutual respect, and they embrace, forging a deep and inseparable friendship that will change both of them forever. With Enkidu by his side, Gilgamesh's restless energy is finally channeled away from tyranny and towards heroic adventure. Together, they embark on a great quest to the cedar forest in the distant north to slay the terrifying monster Humbaba, the guardian appointed by the god Enlil. After a tremendous battle, they succeed and they return to Uruk as celebrated heroes. But their success breeds arrogance. The goddess Inanna, impressed by Gilgamesh's glory, proposes marriage to him. Gilgamesh scornfully rejects her, listing all the mortal lovers she has taken and then discarded. Enraged by this insult, Inanna demands that the gods send the bull of heaven to punish Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu manage to slay the bull, but this final act of defiance is too much for the gods. They decree that one of the two heroes must die. They choose Enkidu. This is the heart of the epic. Gilgamesh is forced to watch as his beloved friend, his other self, is struck down by a slow, wasting illness. Enkidu's death shatters Gilgamesh. He weeps for days, refusing to let his friend be buried, until he sees a maggot fall from his nose. For the first time, the mighty God King is confronted with the stark, physical reality of death. He is overcome not just by grief, but by a chilling, paralyzing terror of his own mortality. He realizes that he too will one day be nothing but dust. This terror launches him on a new, desperate quest, a search for the secret of eternal life. His journey takes him to the very ends of the earth, across the waters of death, to find the only mortal man to have ever escaped it, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood. After listening to Gilgamesh's tale, Utnapishtim confirms the king's worst fears. Immortality is for the gods alone. It is not the destiny of humankind. As a consolation, He tells Gilgamesh of a magical plant at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth. Gilgamesh successfully retrieves the plant, but on his journey home, he stops to bathe, and a snake steals the plant from him, shedding its skin and becoming young again. Defeated and empty-handed, Gilgamesh finally returns to Uruk. As he approaches his home, he looks up at the magnificent baked brick walls that he had once forced his people to build. And in that moment, he has his final revelation. A man cannot live forever, but his works, his city, his story, these can. He finally understands that his true immortality lies not in a magical plant, but in the legacy he leaves behind. The story ends with him pointing out these great walls to the ferryman who brought him home, accepting his mortal fate with a quiet, weary wisdom. The historical consensus is that Gilgamesh was a real king who ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE. His deeds were so great that they became the foundation for this legendary tale, which for the Sumerians was a profound exploration of what it means to be human. The story of Gilgamesh, a blend of myth and memory, gives us a portrait of a fully formed king, a warrior, a builder, and a figure of ultimate authority. But how did this powerful institution, the very concept of a single man ruling a city as his personal domain, first come into being? The journey from communal leadership to hereditary monarchy was not a sudden one, but a slow, pragmatic evolution driven by the ever-present pressures of conflict and survival. In the earliest days of cities like Uruk, it seems that power was not held in a palace, but in the temple. The city's leader was a figure known as the Ensi, or priest king. His authority was primarily religious. He was seen not as a king of people, but as the chief steward of the city's true ruler, its patron god. The entire city-state was considered the god's personal household, and the Ensi was the manager, tasked with overseeing the divine estate, directing the agricultural work, and ensuring the rituals of appeasement were performed correctly. It was a theocracy, a government run by the servants of the gods. This system worked well enough when the primary challenges were internal and agricultural. But as the city-states of Sumer grew in number and size, they began to compete. The flat, open plain of Mesopotamia offered no natural defenses, and the most precious resources, arable land and above all, access to the life-giving water of the irrigation canals, became sources of constant friction. A city upstream could dam a canal, starving its downstream neighbor. Disputes over borders and water rights frequently escalated into armed conflict. In these times of crisis, a community needs a different kind of leader. A priest, skilled in interpreting omens and managing granaries, was not necessarily the best person to lead an army into battle, and so a new tradition arose. When war threatened, the city's council of elders would appoint a temporary war chief, a charismatic and proven warrior chosen for his military prowess. This figure was known as a Lugal, a Sumerian word that literally translates to big man. Initially, the Lugal's authority was meant to be temporary, a short-term commission to last only as long as the crisis. But in the volatile political landscape of ancient Sumer, the crises never truly ended. The threat of war with a neighboring city was a constant looming reality. The big man, having successfully defended his city and earned the loyalty of his soldiers, was often reluctant to relinquish his power. He would argue that his leadership was still needed to ensure the city's safety. He used his command of the army, the only group with a monopoly on organized violence, to consolidate his position, transforming his temporary emergency powers into a permanent hereditary office. Thus, a new center of power was born in the Sumerian city, the palace, the seat of the Lugal, standing as a rival to the ancient authority of the temple. This created a delicate and often tense balance of power. The king and the high priest were now the two most powerful figures in the city, and their relationship was complex. A wise king understood that he could not rule by force alone. He needed divine legitimacy. And so, kings became the greatest patrons of the temples, pouring vast resources into their construction and expansion. They adopted titles like Beloved of Inanna or Chosen of Enlil, framing their rule not as a military coup, but as a divine appointment. The official ideology was that the gods themselves, acting through their chief, Enlil, chose the Lugal to be the shepherd of his people. This metaphor was central to their concept of kingship. A good king was a shepherd who protected his flock from predators, enemy armies, ensured they were well fed by maintaining the canals, and guided them with a firm hand by administering justice. Rebellion against the king was therefore not just a political act, but an act of sacrilege, a rejection of the gods' chosen order. The duties of the king were threefold. First and foremost, he was the commander-in-chief of the army. Second, he was the supreme judge, the final court of appeals for legal disputes among his people. And third, he was the chief builder, responsible for the city's infrastructure. This meant maintaining and expanding the vital irrigation systems, strengthening the defensive walls, and most visibly, building and restoring the great temples and ziggurats, a public display of piety that reinforced his divine mandate. Our most intriguing and most puzzling source for this political history is a document known as the Sumerian King List. It is a cuneiform tablet that purports to list all the kings of Sumer, the cities from which they ruled, and the lengths of their reigns from the very beginning of time. The list begins in a mythical past, before the Great Flood, with 8 kings who have fantastically long reigns, some ruling for over 30,000 years. After the flood, the list continues with kings whose reigns, while still long, become progressively more realistic. Intriguingly, Gilgamesh of Uruk is on the list, credited with a reign of 126 years. Modern historians are still debating what to make of this document. Is it a genuine, if flawed, historical record? Or is it a masterful piece of political propaganda, written much later, to create the impression of a single, ancient, and unbroken line of divinely ordained kingship stretching back to the dawn of time, thereby legitimizing the rule of whatever king happened to be in power when it was written? The answer is likely a bit of both. The later names on the list are known to be real historical figures. The early names are clearly myth. The list shows us that for the Sumerians themselves, the line between myth and history was a blurry one, with their real, mortal kings standing at the end of a long and sacred tradition that began with the gods themselves. This newly ordered world, governed by a king from his palace and served by priests from their temple, was built upon a foundation of more than just divine right and military might. It was built upon a bedrock of quiet, practical, and world-changing ingenuity. While the kings and heroes were composing their grand legends, Anonymous farmers, potters, and brewers were developing the technologies that made the entire civilization possible. These weren't flashy, dramatic inventions, but humble, everyday tools that revolutionized the three pillars of Sumerian life: how they grew their food, how they moved their goods, and how they came together as a community. The first revolution took place in the fields. For centuries, farming had been an act of grueling, personal labor. A farmer would prepare his land for planting by breaking up the clods of earth with a handheld hoe, a task that was slow, exhausting, and inefficient. This method limited the amount of land a single family could cultivate. But then, an unknown agricultural genius had a simple but transformative idea. What if, instead of putting all of your own muscle into the tool, you could harness the power of a much stronger animal? The result was the aard, or the scratch plow. In its earliest form, it was little more than a modified, reinforced hoe with a handle designed to be hitched to a pair of oxen. As the oxen moved forward, the pointed tip of the aard was dragged through the earth, cutting a shallow furrow for the seeds to be planted. The impact of this simple device was immense. A single farmer with his team of oxen could now cultivate a vastly larger area of land than he ever could by hand. It was a force multiplier for human labor. This new efficiency dramatically increased the potential crop yields, which in turn fueled a larger agricultural surplus. This surplus was the very lifeblood of the city, feeding the growing population of non-farmers, the priests, the soldiers, the artisans, and the king himself. The invention of the plow solidified the partnership between humans and domesticated animals, and it was a critical step in turning the irrigated plains of Sumer into the most productive breadbasket the world had ever known. The next great innovation, and perhaps the most famous, is the wheel. Yet the story of its invention is not what most people think. The wheel was not first conceived for transportation, but for industry. The earliest firm evidence we have for the wheel, appearing in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, is its use as a potter's wheel. Before this, pottery was made by laboriously coiling and pinching clay by hand. The potter's wheel, a heavy, spinning horizontal disc, allowed an artisan to use the force of momentum to shape a lump of clay with speed and symmetry. For the first time, pottery could be mass-produced. This was a crucial development for a complex administrative state. The temple bureaucrats who needed to store vast quantities of grain, beer, and oil now had access to thousands of standardized, high-quality ceramic jars. Only later was this concept of a spinning disc turned on its side and adapted for transport. The first wheeled vehicles were not sleek chariots, but clumsy, heavy carts with solid wooden wheels, often made from 3 planks of wood clamped together. Towed by slow-moving oxen or donkeys, they were not particularly useful for long-distance travel over rough terrain, but for hauling heavy goods over short, relatively flat distances, they were another game changer. Imagine the monumental task of building a ziggurat, a project requiring millions of mud bricks. Before the wheeled cart, these bricks would have had to be carried by hand or loaded onto pack animals. With the cart, a far greater quantity could be moved with the same amount of effort. The wheel was the answer to the logistical prayers of ancient project managers, making it possible to mobilize the resources needed for their monumental building projects. But perhaps the most beloved of all Sumerian inventions was one born from an accident. It's easy to imagine how it happened. A piece of barley bread left in a jar got wet from a leaking roof. Wild yeast in the air began to feast on the sugars in the grain, and the mixture began to bubble and ferment. Eventually, a curious or thirsty person decided to taste the resulting sour, slightly alcoholic gruel. This was the likely birth of beer. For the Sumerians, beer was not a luxury. It was a cornerstone of their existence. It was so important that they even worshipped a goddess of brewing, Ninkasi. Their beer was not the clear, filtered beverage we know today. It was thick, cloudy, and porridge-like, often drunk through a straw to filter out the solids. It was incredibly nutritious, a source of vital calories and vitamins, often called liquid bread. In a world where river water could be dangerously contaminated, the alcohol in the beer made it a much safer daily drink. It was also a fundamental part of the economy. Remember those early cuneiform tablets from Uruk? Many of them are wage lists, recording payments to laborers not in coin, which did not yet exist, but in daily rations of beer. It was the social lubricant of their society, drunk at religious festivals, at public gatherings, and at the end of a long day of building a civilization. The plow fed the people, the wheel helped them build, but beer, in its own way, may have helped to make it all worthwhile. The world of the Sumerians, for all its shared culture, language, and religion, was a fractured one. The Mesopotamian plain was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork quilt of fiercely independent and perpetually quarreling city-states. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, Umma, each was its own little kingdom, with its own Lugal, its own patron god, and its own ambitions. They traded with each other. They worshipped the same pantheon, but mostly they fought. For centuries, the history of Sumer was a dreary, repetitive cycle of one city gaining a temporary advantage over its neighbors, forcing them to pay tribute for a generation or two before being inevitably overthrown by a new rising power. It was a world of endless small-scale conflict, a political stalemate waiting for a figure with a vision grander than just being the biggest fish in a small, crowded pond. That figure would come not from the south, from the Sumerian heartland, but from the north, and he was not born to be a king. His name was Sargon, and his story begins not with a royal genealogy, but with a powerful legend, one that he himself likely encouraged to obscure his humble origins. The tale, recorded in texts written long after his death, is hauntingly familiar. It claims Sargon was the secret child of a high priestess who, forbidden to raise him, placed him as a newborn into a basket woven from reeds, sealed it with bitumen, and set it adrift on the waters of the Euphrates River. The current carried the basket downstream until it was discovered by a man named Akkad, a humble gardener, who drew the baby from the water and raised him as his own son. This story of a hero of mysterious birth rescued from the water is a timeless archetype, a way of marking a man as touched by destiny, chosen not by bloodline, but by the gods themselves. History first finds the real Sargon in the powerful city of Kish, where he served as the cupbearer to the king. This was no menial position. The cupbearer was a trusted confidant, a high-ranking official who was always at the king's side. From this place of proximity to power, Sargon made his move. Through means that are lost to history, he usurped the throne, but he did not stay in Kish. Instead, He built himself an entirely new capital city, a city that would be the heart of his new world order. He called it Akkad. And from this power base, Sargon, an Akkadian who spoke a Semitic language entirely different from Sumerian, set out to do something no Lugal had ever truly accomplished before. He set out to conquer everyone. Sargon was a military genius. He broke from the Sumerian model of a city militia and created what may have been the world's first professional standing army, a loyal force of soldiers whose only job was to fight for him. With this new military machine, he marched south into the Sumerian heartland. He defeated the armies of the city-states one by one, tearing down their defensive walls and capturing their kings. He was relentless. A text boasts that in one campaign he fought 34 battles and was victorious in them all. His ambition was boundless. He pushed his conquests far beyond Mesopotamia into modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and parts of Turkey and Iran. He famously declared that he had washed his weapons in the sea, a declaration that he had reached the Persian Gulf and now controlled the entire known world, from the mountains to the ocean. This was not just a bigger kingdom. It was a new political entity entirely. This was the world's first true empire, a large, multi-ethnic, multilingual state created through conquest and ruled by a single dominant power. To hold this vast and restive territory together, Sargon developed a new imperial playbook. He installed trusted Akkadian governors to rule over the conquered Sumerian cities, and he stationed garrisons of his own troops to quell any thoughts of rebellion. But his most brilliant move was one of cultural and religious consolidation. He did not try to stamp out Sumerian culture. Instead, he cleverly wove the two cultures together. He appointed his own daughter, a brilliant woman named Enheduanna, to be the high priestess of the most important Sumerian temple in the south, the temple of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur. This was a masterstroke. It placed his own family at the heart of his subjects' religious life, linking the new Akkadian dynasty directly to the ancient Sumerian gods. Enheduanna, incidentally, is the world's first author known by name, a remarkable poet whose hymns to the gods were preserved for centuries. Sargon's reign was a watershed moment in history, the beginning of a new age of empires. Yet for all his fame, for all the power of the city he built, we are left with a profound mystery. The capital of the world's first empire, the glorious city of Akkad, has never been found. Archaeologists have searched for it for over a century, digging through the dusty tells of Iraq, guided by clues in ancient inscriptions. We know it was a city of legendary wealth and power, but its precise location remains one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in ancient history. The man who conquered the world and created a new kind of power left behind an empire of memory, but his capital city remains a ghost. The empire that Sargon forged was more than just a new name on a map. It was a fundamental reordering of the world. For the first time, the disparate, bickering cities of the Mesopotamian plain were united under a single, centralized authority. A merchant traveling from the southern city of Ur to the northern city of Mari no longer had to cross hostile borders or pay tariffs to a dozen different petty kings. He was now, for the first time, traveling within a single state. The official language of this new state was not Sumerian, but Sargon's native Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that would become the new lingua franca of the entire Near East. Decrees written by scribes in the capital city of Akkad were sent out to governors across the empire, creating a level of administrative cohesion that had been previously unthinkable. This new unity fostered an economic boom. The Akkadian kings established standardized systems of weights and measures, which streamlined trade and made commerce more predictable. The imperial army secured the great trade routes, making it safer for caravans to bring precious goods into the Mesopotamian heartland. Cedarwood from the mountains of Lebanon, silver from Anatolia, and the coveted deep blue lapis lazuli from the distant mines of Afghanistan. The wealth of the known world now flowed into the imperial treasury at Akkad. This economic integration, backed by military might, was the true glue that held the empire together. The old loyalties to one's local city began to be replaced, however slowly and reluctantly, by a new identity as a subject of a larger imperial system. But the Akkadian rulers were too shrewd to simply govern by force and economics alone. They understood the deep, ancient power of Sumerian culture, and they did not try to erase it. Instead, they masterfully wove the two cultures together into a new, hybrid Mesopotamian identity. While Akkadian was the language of government, the old Sumerian language was preserved as the sacred tongue of religion and high literature, much like Latin would be in medieval Europe. Educated scribes were bilingual, able to read the ancient Sumerian myths and compose new royal inscriptions in the Akkadian tongue. The pantheon of gods also underwent a process of fusion. The Sumerian gods were not replaced. They were simply given new Akkadian names and absorbed into the imperial religion. The fiery goddess of love and war, Inanna, became the even more famous Ishtar. The wise god of water, Enki, was now known as Ea. The sun god Utu became Shamash. This religious syncretism was a powerful unifying force, creating a shared religious culture that would endure for the next 2,000 years. This new imperial confidence was reflected in the arts of the period. Sumerian art had often been formal, pious, and rather static. It depicted worshippers with wide, serene eyes, standing in passive adoration of their gods. Akkadian art was different. It was dynamic, realistic, and infused with a powerful sense of action and individual personality. It celebrated the glory of the king. This is seen most dramatically in the victory stele of Naram-Sin, one of Sargon's grandsons and most powerful successors. The monument shows the king, larger than all the other figures, marching triumphantly up a mountain over the trampled bodies of his enemies. He is depicted as a heroic, muscular figure wearing a horned helmet, a symbol of divinity that had previously been reserved only for the gods. This was a shocking and audacious statement. Naram-Sin was the first Mesopotamian king to deify himself, to declare himself a living god. The old Sumerian model of the king as the humble shepherd and servant of the gods was being replaced by a new, far more arrogant vision of the king as a divine conqueror. This supreme confidence, however, may have contained the seeds of the empire's destruction. After about a century and a half of dominance, the mighty Akkadian Empire collapsed, suddenly and spectacularly. For a long time, the reasons were a mystery, but a later Sumerian literary work, a poem known as The Curse of Akkad, offers a chilling, if biased, explanation. The poem tells a story of how the great king Naram-Sin, in a fit of hubris and frustration that the gods were not giving him what he wanted, committed the ultimate act of sacrilege. He marched his army to the holy city of Nippur, the sacred seat of the chief god Enlil, and destroyed his temple. According to the story, this act enraged Enlil beyond measure. In his fury, he abandoned the city of Akkad, withdrawing his divine protection, and summoned a fierce, barbaric people from the Zagros Mountains, the Gutians, to descend upon the land as a plague. The poem describes them as a people who knew no inhibition, laying the empire to waste and plunging Mesopotamia into chaos. Historians today still debate the truth of this story. Did Naram-Sin really sack the temple, or is this a piece of later Sumerian propaganda, a theological cautionary tale created to explain the trauma of the empire's fall by blaming it on the impiety of their foreign overlords? Whatever the specific cause, the curse was real in its effect. The world's first empire, which had seemed so invincible, was about to be washed away. The fall of the world's first empire was not a single, clean event, but a slow and messy unraveling. The poetic Curse of Akkad blames the catastrophe on the singular impiety of a single king, a satisfyingly simple explanation for a traumatic collapse. But the truth, as revealed by archaeology and the patient science of climate reconstruction, is more complex and perhaps even more terrifying. The Akkadian Empire, for all its military might, was a fragile giant, and it was assailed not by one, but by a perfect storm of internal and external pressures that brought it to its knees. Internally, the empire was never truly at peace. The proud Sumerian cities of the south chafed under Akkadian rule. They saw their conquerors as outsiders, and for over a century they launched repeated, desperate rebellions. Holding the empire together required constant and exhausting military campaigns, draining the treasury and the morale of the Akkadian heartland. The empire was a coiled spring of internal tension, held in check only by the strength of its kings. But as a new century dawned, that strength began to fail in the face of a far greater and more indiscriminate power: the climate. Scientific evidence gathered from ice cores in Greenland, from the sediment layers of ancient lakes, and from stalagmites in caves across the Middle East all point to the same stark conclusion. Around 2200 BCE, a sudden and severe multi-century drought struck the entire region. This wasn't just a few dry years. It was a catastrophic shift in weather patterns that caused the rains to fail year after year. The northern plains of Mesopotamia, the breadbasket of the Akkadian Empire, turned to dust. Widespread crop failures led to famine, and famine led to social breakdown. Refugees from the desiccated north likely poured into the cities of the south, straining resources and increasing instability. The centralized imperial government, which depended on agricultural tribute to feed its army and its bureaucracy, would have had its economic foundation completely cut out from under it. The giant was starving, and it began to stagger. It was into this weakened, chaotic, and fractured land that a new people swept down from the east. They came from the Zagros Mountains, a tribal people known as the Gutians. To the sophisticated urban dwellers of Mesopotamia, the Gutians were the ultimate barbarians. Surviving Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe them with undisguised horror and contempt, calling them a plague on the land and painting them as uncivilized savages who looked like monkeys and did not know how to properly worship the gods or perform burial rites. They were the embodiment of chaos, the antithesis of the ordered, predictable world of the city-states. The Gutians were not empire builders in the Akkadian mold. They appear to have had little interest in the complex arts of administration, irrigation management, or bureaucracy. They were, by all accounts, primarily raiders and warlords. They toppled the last vestiges of the Akkadian dynasty and established a loose and largely ineffective control over the land. Their reign was not one of centralized government, but of fragmentation and disruption. International trade routes withered, monumental building projects ceased, and the quality of art and literature declined. For Mesopotamia, it was a dark age. The great political experiment of a unified empire had failed, and the land broke apart once more into a collection of bickering, independent city-states, just as it had been before the coming of Sargon. Yet, the darkness was not absolute. While the northern heartland of what had been Akkad suffered greatly, some of the old Sumerian cities in the south found ways to endure and even thrive in this new, decentralized world. They paid tribute to their Gutan overlords when they had to, but otherwise managed their own affairs. One city in particular, Lagash, experienced a remarkable period of peace and prosperity under its pious and wise ruler, a man named Gudea. Instead of waging war, Gudea poured his city's resources into building and restoring temples. Some of the most beautiful and serene works of Sumerian art, exquisite polished diorite statues of Gudea himself, depicted in an attitude of calm and humble prayer, date from this chaotic period. These statues, and the flourishing of culture they represent, were a quiet act of defiance. They were a testament to the resilience of Sumerian civilization. A small flame of order and piety kept burning through the long, dark night of the Gutian occupation. It was a sign that, even though the world's first empire was dead and buried, the Sumerian spirit was not. That small flame of Sumerian culture, so carefully tended in cities like Lagash during the long Gutian occupation, was about to grow into a roaring fire. The grip of the mountain tribes on the Mesopotamian plain was never that of a true, organized empire. It was the grip of a predator, strong but unfocused. After nearly a century of disruption and humiliation, the Sumerian cities had had enough. A king of Uruk named Utu-Hengal raised the banner of rebellion, marshaling a coalition of Sumerian forces. He decisively defeated the Gutian king, and as his inscriptions proudly state, drove the stinging serpent of the mountains out of the land for good. Sumer was free once more. Utu-Hengal's moment of glory was brief, but he had opened the door for a new, even greater power to emerge. Upon his death, leadership of the newly liberated Sumer passed to his governor in the great southern city of Ur, a brilliant and ambitious man named Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu was not content to be just another city king in a fractured landscape. He had a grander vision. He set out to reunify all of Mesopotamia under his rule, consciously emulating the great Sargon of Akkad. But this would be a Sumerian empire, a restoration of the land to its original heartland rulers. He took for himself the majestic title, King of Sumer and Akkad, a clear declaration of his intent to rule both the south and the north. With this, he founded the third dynasty of Ur, a period of such extraordinary peace, prosperity, and cultural brilliance that historians now refer to it as the Sumerian Renaissance. This Renaissance was, above all, an era of rebuilding. After a century of neglect, the great cities and the vital canal systems were in disrepair. Ur-Nammu became one of the greatest builders in Mesopotamian history, launching massive construction projects across his new kingdom. He restored the temples of the old gods and strengthened the defensive walls of the cities. His crowning achievement, a monument that still stands today as a testament to his vision, was the Great Ziggurat of Ur. Call back to Section 7. He took the foundations of an older, smaller temple and transformed it into the most magnificent ziggurat the world had ever seen. Its massive base and three-tiered structure, with its enormous converging staircases, was a powerful symbol of renewed Sumerian pride and piety, a declaration that the gods once again favored their chosen people. To govern his reunified kingdom, Ur-Nammu and his successors created what was perhaps the most highly centralized and meticulously organized bureaucracy in ancient history. They learned from the Akkadian model, but perfected it with an almost obsessive focus on record-keeping. Archaeologists have unearthed over 100,000 cuneiform tablets from this brief period, and they are overwhelmingly administrative. They are tax receipts for livestock, detailed records of land surveys, rosters of laborers assigned to canal digging projects, and receipts for daily rations of beer and barley. Every transaction, every transfer of goods, every hour of labor seems to have been recorded, categorized, and filed by an army of scribes. It was a state run by accountants, a society where the stylus was as mighty as the sword. Yet, Ur-Nammu's most profound and enduring legacy was not in brick or bureaucracy, but in an idea. He is credited with giving the world its very first written code of laws. Discovered on a damaged tablet, the Code of Ur-Nammu predates the far more famous Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. It is a document of breathtaking importance, for it represents one of civilization's greatest leaps forward. The principle that justice should not be arbitrary or subject to a ruler's whim, but should be based on a consistent, publicly known set of rules. The code begins with a beautiful prologue, where Ur-Nammu declares that he wants to establish equity in the land, protecting the orphan from the rich and the widow from the powerful. The laws themselves are remarkable for their humanity. Where later codes would famously demand an eye for an eye, Ur-Nammu's justice was largely based on financial compensation. One law states, if a man knocks out the eye of another man, he shall weigh out 1/2 a mina of silver. Another says, if a man in the course of a scuffle smashes another man's limb with a club, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. It was an attempt to replace cycles of personal vengeance with a system of rational, state-administered justice. Ur-Nammu's son, Shulgi, inherited this prosperous and well-ordered kingdom and reigned for a long and glorious 48 years. He completed his father's building projects, further reformed the administration and the calendar, and in a move that echoed the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, he deified himself, declaring himself a living god. This was a golden age. The schools for scribes flourished, and it was during this period that many of the great works of Sumerian literature, including the epic tales of Gilgamesh, were copied, edited, and preserved in the forms we know today. It was a conscious act of cultural preservation, a proud civilization looking back at its own heroic past. The Sumerian Renaissance was a final, brilliant flowering of this ancient culture, a brief but beautiful autumn before the long winter was to set in. That final, brilliant autumn of the Sumerian people was destined to be tragically brief. The great centralized state created by Ur-Nammu, for all its order and efficiency, was a rigid and brittle machine. Its vast bureaucracy was immensely expensive, a hungry beast that required a constant, massive intake of agricultural surplus to feed its legions of scribes, officials, and soldiers. The entire system depended on the unwavering productivity of the southern Mesopotamian heartland. And after 3,000 years of intensive irrigation, the land itself was beginning to tire. The soil was growing salty and less fertile, crop yields were slowly declining, and the kingdom's economic foundations were becoming dangerously unstable. The highly centralized system, which had been a source of strength in times of stability, lacked the flexibility to adapt to this slow-burning environmental crisis. As the kingdom weakened from within, new and formidable threats began to press in from the outside. From the west, out of the Syrian desert, came the steady, inexorable migration of a new group of Semitic-speaking peoples, the Amorites. The Sumerian scribes described them with the familiar disdain of the city dweller for the nomad, calling them a people who know no grain, who live in tents, and who dig up truffles in the foothills. They were not, at first, a conquering army, but a relentless tide of tribes and clans, pushing against the empire's borders, disrupting trade, and squatting on agricultural lands. The last kings of Ur grew so desperate that they built a massive wall, more than 170 miles long, in a futile attempt to hold them back. While the west frayed, a more direct military threat reemerged from the east. The Elamites, the ancient powerful rivals of Mesopotamia from the highlands of modern-day Iran, saw the Sumerian kingdom's weakness as their opportunity. The final king of the dynasty, a man named Ibbi-Sin, found himself presiding over a rapidly disintegrating empire. The great bureaucratic machine ground to a halt as famine took hold. Provincial governors, seeing the central authority collapse, broke away and declared their own little kingdoms. The Amorites poured across the now undefended borders. The end came not with a slow fade, but with a sudden, violent blow. The Elamites marched from the mountains, likely in alliance with other rebellious factions, and descended upon the capital. The sack of Ur, around the year 2004 BCE, was an event of profound and lasting trauma for the Mesopotamian world. The great capital of the Sumerian Renaissance, the holy city of the moon god Nana, was brutally destroyed. Its temples were desecrated, its magnificent ziggurat was damaged, its people were slaughtered, and its last king, Ibbi-Sin, was led away in chains to Elam, never to be seen again. This was more than just a military defeat. It was seen as a cosmic catastrophe, a sign that the gods themselves had abandoned Sumer. The depth of this sorrow is captured in one of the most moving works of ancient literature, a long poem known as the Lament for Ur. It is a heartbreaking elegy for a fallen city, a civilization mourning its own death. In the poem, the city's patron goddess, Ningal, weeps bitterly as she pleads with the council of the gods to spare her home. But the great god, Enlil's judgment, is final. The poem describes the horrifying aftermath in vivid, sorrowful detail. In its streets, where the feasting crowds would stroll, scattered bodies lay. In its boulevards, where the festive games were held, heads lay fallen. The blood of the people, like molten copper and tin, filled all the holes. Its dead, like fat on the water, melted away in the sun. The lament speaks of a silent city where the songs and the sounds of craftsmanship have ceased, a house of holiness, now exposed to the wind and rain. It was the poetic expression of a people who had lost everything. The fall of Ur marked the effective end of the Sumerians as a recognizable political and cultural force. They were not wiped out as a people, but they would never again rule themselves. The Sumerian language, already in decline, soon ceased to be spoken in the streets and marketplaces, surviving only as a dead, classical language studied by scribes, much like Latin in Europe. The future of Mesopotamia would belong to the newcomers, the Amorites, and other Semitic-speaking peoples who now rushed in to fill the power vacuum. The first, and in many ways the greatest, of all civilizations had finally come to its end. But their legacy was not erased. Their conquerors and successors would build their own civilizations directly upon the foundations that the Sumerians had laid, adopting their writing, their religion, their laws, and their knowledge of the heavens. The first voice of history had fallen silent, but its echoes were about to be picked up by another. The fall of Ur left a gaping power vacuum at the heart of the civilized world. The great unifying structure of the Sumerian state was gone, and the land fractured once more into a mosaic of competing kingdoms. Into this void stepped the Amorite chieftains. Over the next 2 centuries, these former nomads completed their transformation, seizing control of the ancient Sumerian cities and establishing their own dynasties. Kings with Amorite names now sat on the thrones of Isin, Larsa, and Eshnunna. They adopted the sophisticated trappings of Mesopotamian civilization, worshipping the Sumerian gods, using the Cuneiform script, and claiming the ancient titles of Sumerian kingship. The era that followed, known as the Isin-Larsa period, was a chaotic and violent return to the old ways of endless petty warfare, a sprawling political chess match with a dozen different players all vying for supremacy. During this time, a city on the banks of the Euphrates River, which had previously been a minor, politically insignificant town, began a slow and patient ascent. Its name was Babylon. For a long time, it was just another small piece on the board, overshadowed by its larger and more powerful neighbors. An Amorite chieftain established a dynasty there, and his first few successors were modest kings who spent their reigns carefully consolidating their small territory, building up the city's walls, and engaging in the treacherous diplomacy of the day. They were cautious, they were clever, and they bided their time. They were laying the foundations for the 6th king in their line, a young man who would inherit this small but stable kingdom and transform it into the center of the world. His name was Hammurabi. When Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon in 1792 BCE, he was by no means the most powerful king in Mesopotamia. To the south, the kingdom of Larsa controlled the ancient Sumerian heartland. To the north, the kingdom of Mari was a major commercial hub. To the east, the kingdom of Eshnunna was a formidable military power. Hammurabi was an underdog, surrounded by sharks. But he possessed 2 virtues in abundance: patience and cunning. For the first 30 years of his reign, He played the part of the minor king to perfection, all while building his strength in secret. He was a master of diplomacy, a spider weaving a complex web of alliances and intrigue. The cuneiform archives found in the ruins of other cities have given us a remarkable insight into his methods. We can read the letters he exchanged with other rulers, and they reveal a brilliant and ruthless political operator. He would form an alliance with one king to attack a second, all while sending secret messages to a third, promising future friendship. He would loan troops to an ally, only to recall them at a critical moment. He played his rivals against each other with masterful skill, letting them exhaust themselves in endless wars, while Babylon grew stronger in relative peace. He used a sophisticated network of spies to keep him informed of his enemy's every move. For 3 decades he watched, he planned, and he waited for the perfect moment to strike. And then, with his rivals weakened and his own power consolidated, he showed his true hand. In a stunning series of swift and brilliant military campaigns, Hammurabi shattered the political stalemate that had defined the region for 2 centuries. He turned on his former allies one by one, defeating them with a speed and decisiveness that left the world aghast. He first conquered the southern kingdom of Larsa, then marched east to subdue Eshnunna. Finally, he turned on his longtime ally, the prosperous city of Mari, which he not only conquered but also ordered to be systematically destroyed. Its great palace burned to the ground. In just over a decade, Hammurabi had done the impossible. He had defeated all his rivals and unified the entirety of Mesopotamia under his rule. The first Babylonian Empire was born, and the city of Babylon was now its capital, the undisputed center of civilization. Under Hammurabi's new unified rule, Babylon was transformed from a provincial town into a metropolis. It became the largest and most prosperous city in the world, a hub for trade, religion, and culture. But this raises a fascinating historical question about the man at its center. The traditional portrait of Hammurabi, based on his own royal inscriptions, is that of a wise and just ruler, a benevolent shepherd of his people. But the diplomatic letters uncovered from the archives of his enemies, particularly those from the city of Mari, which he so ruthlessly destroyed, paint a much darker picture of a cunning, manipulative, and treacherous politician. So who was the real Hammurabi? Was he the pious king of his own propaganda, or the Machiavellian prince revealed in his secret correspondence? The truth, of course, is that he was almost certainly both. To build and maintain an empire in that brutal world, he had to be a master of war and intrigue. But to make that empire last, he understood that he also had to be a master of peace and justice. To build an empire through conquest is one thing. To hold it together through peace is another entirely. Hammurabi, the master strategist, understood that military might alone was not enough to govern a diverse and sprawling kingdom. To transform his conquests into a stable, unified state, he needed to give his people a shared sense of order and justice. His solution was an act of political and legal genius, a monument that would become his most enduring legacy and one of the most famous artifacts of the ancient world, his great code of laws. His masterpiece is preserved for us today on a stunning 7.5-foot tall pillar of black diorite discovered in 1901 and now standing as the centerpiece of the Mesopotamian collection at the Louvre Museum. At the very top of this stone pillar, or stele, is a beautifully carved relief. It depicts Hammurabi standing, his hand raised to his mouth in a gesture of respectful prayer. Before him sits the great god Shamash, the sun god and the divine arbiter of justice. The god, with flames rising from his shoulders, extends to the king a rod and a ring, the sacred symbols of divine authority. The message of this image is clear and powerful. The laws that are about to be listed are not the mere opinions of a mortal king. They are the will of the heavens, delivered to Hammurabi to be implemented on earth. Below this image, covering nearly the entire surface of the pillar in meticulous rows of Akkadian cuneiform, are the 282 laws that make up his code. Hammurabi did not invent these laws out of thin air. Rather, he collected, edited, and standardized the existing legal traditions from the long history of Sumer and Akkad. His goal was to create a single, comprehensive legal framework that would apply to everyone in his empire, from the southern marshes to the northern plains. In the code's magnificent prologue, he declares that the gods have appointed him to make justice shine in the land, to destroy the evil and the wicked, that the strong might not oppress the weak. It was a declaration of a new era of imperial order. The laws themselves provide a fascinating glimpse into the life and the mindset of Babylonian society. The most famous principle is that of retributive justice, lex talionis, or an eye for an eye. Law 196 states, "If a man has destroyed the eye of a member of the aristocracy, they shall destroy his eye." Law 200 says, "If a man has knocked out a tooth of a man of his own rank, they shall knock out his tooth." This principle of equal retaliation marks a shift from the earlier Sumerian law codes, like that of Ur-Nammu, which primarily relied on monetary fines. However, this equality was not absolute. The law was explicitly stratified by social class. If the same man destroyed the eye of a commoner, he did not lose his own. He simply had to pay a fine of 1 mina of silver. If he destroyed the eye of a slave, the fine was even less. Justice in Babylon was not blind. It looked very carefully at your social standing. The code covers nearly every aspect of life. There are laws governing trade and commerce, setting a minimum wage for laborers and artisans. There are laws concerning agriculture, property disputes, and debt. A huge portion of the code is dedicated to family law, marriage contracts, divorce settlements, inheritance, and adoption. It even delves into matters of professional malpractice. Law 218 states that if a physician performs a major operation on a nobleman and causes the man's death, the physician's hands shall be cut off. The code also shows a concern for due process. The very first laws deal with false accusations, making it a capital offense to accuse another man of a crime you cannot prove. Yet, for all its fame, modern historians have begun to question the true purpose of this magnificent object. Was it a code in the modern sense? A statute book that judges were expected to consult daily to render their verdicts? The evidence for this is surprisingly thin. We have thousands of court records from this period, and not a single one ever makes a direct reference to Hammurabi's stele. This has led to a fascinating historical debate. Perhaps the code was not a practical legal document, but rather a monumental piece of royal propaganda, a sort of idealized legal treatise. In this view, Hammurabi had it created and placed in a public square, not for judges to use, but for his subjects and the gods to see, a timeless declaration of his own wisdom and piety. It was a monument that celebrated him as the perfect king of justice. Whatever its true function, its influence was immense. It was copied by scribes for over 1,000 years and became the foundational legal text of Mesopotamian civilization, an enduring symbol of the idea that a ruler's greatest duty is to establish a just and ordered world for his people. The magnificent legal and political structure that Hammurabi built seemed destined to last for ages. His dynasty, the first dynasty of Babylon, continued to rule from the great city for several generations after his death, but none of his successors possessed his unique blend of military genius and diplomatic cunning. The vast empire he had conquered began to fray at the edges. The southern provinces, the old Sumerian heartland, broke away to form their own independent kingdom. Rebellions simmered, and the kingdom gradually shrank, a slow and steady decline from a world empire back to a regional power. Babylon was still a city of immense wealth, prestige, and cultural importance, but its military power was a shadow of its former self. It was a rich and tempting prize, waiting for a predator bold enough to strike at its heart. That predator would come from an entirely new direction. Far to the northwest, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey, a new superpower had quietly risen. They were the Hittites, a formidable and enigmatic people who spoke an Indo-European language, completely unrelated to the Semitic and Sumerian tongues of Mesopotamia. From their heavily fortified capital city of Hattusa, nestled among rocky crags, they had forged a powerful empire of their own. The Hittites were innovators. They were among the first peoples to master the difficult art of ironworking, a technology that would eventually change the face of warfare. But their true military advantage in this era was their perfection of the light, horse-drawn war chariot. In the flat, open plains of the Near East, a squadron of these fast-moving, three-man chariots was a terrifying and often unstoppable weapon, the Bronze Age equivalent of an armored cavalry charge. For a long time, the worlds of the Hittites and the Babylonians were separate, two great powers in their own spheres of influence. But in the year 1595 BCE, a young and ambitious Hittite king named Mursili I did something that no one could have predicted. In an act of breathtaking military audacity, he led his army out of their mountain strongholds and embarked on one of the most daring long-distance campaigns in ancient history. He marched his forces hundreds and hundreds of miles down the Euphrates River Valley on a lightning raid aimed at a single spectacular target, the city of Babylon itself. The attack was a complete shock. The weakened Babylonian kingdom was entirely unprepared for a strike of this magnitude from a foe so distant. The Hittite army stormed the legendary city, breaking through the defenses that had once seemed so impenetrable. They plundered the palaces and temples, stripping them of the immense wealth that had been accumulated over centuries. It was a brutal and devastating sack, and in a final act of profound humiliation, they seized the most sacred object in the entire kingdom, the cult statue of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, and hauled it back to their own land as a trophy. For the Babylonians, this was a national trauma of the highest order. It was as if their god himself had been taken into captivity. But then, having achieved this stunning victory, the Hittites did something utterly bizarre. They left. They did not occupy Babylon, install a governor, or attempt to annex the territory into their own empire. They simply packed up their vast quantities of loot, took the statue of Marduk, and marched all the way back home to Anatolia. This strange turn of events is one of the great puzzles of ancient history. Why would a king launch such a costly and difficult military expedition, achieve a total victory, and then immediately abandon the prize? The reasons are still debated. Perhaps Mursili had received word of political conspiracies back in his capital and needed to rush home to secure his throne, a plausible theory, as he was, in fact, assassinated in a palace coup shortly after his return. Or perhaps the logistics of supplying an occupying army so far from home were simply impossible. Some historians even suggest the raid was never intended as a conquest at all, but as an audacious smash-and-grab operation designed to enrich the Hittite kingdom and eliminate Babylon as a potential rival in one swift blow. Whatever the reason, the Hittite thunderbolt had done its work. The raid had effectively decapitated the Babylonian state. The last king of Hammurabi's great dynasty was overthrown, and the political order of Mesopotamia was shattered. The Hittites had created a power vacuum, and just as had happened centuries before, after the fall of Akkad, a new and mysterious group of mountain people were waiting in the wings to fill it. They were the Kassites, and thanks to the Hittites, the path was now clear for them to seize control of Babylon, where they would rule for the next 400 years. The Hittites had been a fleeting, destructive storm, but they had changed the course of Mesopotamian history forever. While the long dynasty of the Kassite kings settled in for a quiet and relatively stable rule in southern Babylonia, a new and far more formidable power was stirring in the north. The political center of gravity in Mesopotamia was beginning a slow, decisive shift upstream along the Tigris River to the rugged heartland of a people who would forge an empire built not on trade or bureaucracy, but on the cold, hard logic of military supremacy. These were the Assyrians, and they would perfect the art of war in a way the world had never before seen. The Assyrian homeland was centered on the ancient city of Ashur, located on a high bluff overlooking the Tigris. Unlike the flat, irrigated alluvial plains of Sumer and Babylon in the south, this was a land of rolling hills and plains that depended on rainfall for its agriculture. More importantly, it was an open and vulnerable land. It had no natural defenses, no mountains or vast deserts to protect it from the hostile tribes and rival kingdoms that surrounded it. This geography, many historians believe, is the key to understanding the Assyrian character. From their earliest days, they were a people under siege, forced to fight constantly for their very survival. This harsh reality forged a deeply militaristic society, a nation where the state and the army were essentially one and the same. War was not just a tool of foreign policy, it was the central organizing principle of their entire civilization. Their chief national god, for whom their first capital was named, was Ashur, a divine warrior. And the Assyrian king was not just a ruler. He was Ashur's high priest and the commander-in-chief of his earthly armies. For centuries, Assyria had been a minor player on the international stage, a small kingdom often dominated by its more powerful neighbors like the Mitanni or the Babylonians. But during the great chaos of the Late Bronze Age collapse, around the 1200 BCE, a period when great empires like the Hittites were mysteriously wiped off the map, the hardy and resilient Assyrians not only survived, but thrived. In the ensuing power vacuum, they began to assert their dominance, first securing their borders, and then embarking on a relentless campaign of expansion. Over the next few centuries, they honed their military into the most sophisticated and terrifying fighting force the world had yet produced. The Assyrian army was a marvel of organization and innovation. It was a professional, standing army with a clear command structure, a corps of engineers, and a mastery of logistics that allowed it to campaign year after year. They were among the first to equip their armies on a massive scale with weapons made of iron, which was stronger and more readily available than bronze. But their true genius, the innovation that made them the masters of their age, was their perfection of siege warfare. Before the Assyrians, a city with strong walls could often withstand an attack for years. The Assyrians developed a complete tactical toolkit designed to bring those walls crashing down. An Assyrian siege was a terrifying spectacle of disciplined violence and psychological terror. Enormous, multi-storied wooden siege towers on wheels would be slowly rolled towards the city walls, bristling with archers who could shoot down upon the defenders from an elevated position. Beneath them, mighty battering rams, huge logs with heavy metal-tipped heads, housed in armored sheds to protect their crews, would hammer relentlessly against the city's gates, the rhythmic, percussive blows echoing for days on end. At the same time, specialized military engineers, known as sappers, would be at work, digging tunnels under the walls in an attempt to undermine their foundations and make them collapse. If the walls were too strong to breach, the Assyrians would simply build a massive earthen ramp up against them, allowing their soldiers to storm the ramparts directly. Just as important as these physical weapons was their mastery of psychological warfare. The Assyrians deliberately cultivated a reputation for unimaginable cruelty, understanding that terror could be their most effective weapon. They would deliver ultimatums to cities, demanding their surrender and promising swift and horrible retribution if they refused, and they kept their promises. After a city was conquered, they would engage in public, systematic acts of horror. They flayed captured leaders alive, impaled prisoners on sharpened stakes outside the city gates, and made grim pyramids of severed heads as a warning to all who might consider defying the will of Ashur. They did not hide these atrocities. They celebrated them, carving them in graphic and horrifying detail on the stone walls of their royal palaces for all visiting dignitaries to see. The goal was simple: to make the very idea of resistance so terrifying that other cities would choose to surrender and pay tribute rather than face the wrath of the Assyrian war machine. This raises a persistent historical debate. Were the Assyrians uniquely savage in an already brutal age, or were they simply the first to understand and master the dark art of state-sponsored propaganda, using their own well-publicized terror as a tool of imperial policy? The purpose of this relentless, terrifying, and highly efficient war machine was not just conquest for its own sake. The point of it all was to funnel the wealth, resources, and labor of the entire known world into the Assyrian heartland, there to build capital cities of such scale and magnificence that they would leave no doubt as to who was the master of the world. Under the great kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, cities like Nimrud and greatest of all, Nineveh, became sprawling showcases of imperial power, financed by the plunder of 1,000 defeated foes. To walk through the gates of Nineveh in the 7th century BCE, during the reign of a king like Sennacherib or Ashurbanipal, was to witness the apex of Assyrian glory. The city itself, situated on the east bank of the Tigris River, was an awesome feat of engineering, the largest city in the world at its time. It was surrounded by a massive double wall, nearly 8 miles in circumference, and pierced by at least 15 monumental gates. These gateways were not merely functional, they were theological and psychological thresholds. They were guarded by colossal stone statues of Lamassu, awe-inspiring mythical beasts with the body of a bull, the wings of an eagle, and the calm, bearded face of a king. These silent stone guardians were designed to intimidate all who entered, projecting an aura of divine power and warding off the forces of chaos. Passing through these gates, one would enter a city of stunning contrasts. The spoils of empire were everywhere. Sennacherib built for himself a magnificent new home, which he immodestly named the Palace Without Rival. Its walls were lined with nearly 2 miles of the most intricate and detailed stone reliefs, the empire's brutal propaganda carved in stone for all to see. Room after room, the story of Assyrian dominance was told in vivid detail. One series of carvings would show the king on his war chariot, leading his army into battle. The next would show the graphic details of an Assyrian siege in progress, with the ramps, the battering rams, and the archers all at work. Further on, long, sad processions of captive peoples from foreign lands, from Phoenicia, from Israel, from Elam, are shown being led away into exile, their heads bowed. And in the most prominent positions were the scenes of victory and punishment, the king on his throne, receiving endless lines of tribute bearers, while his soldiers count piles of severed heads or flay captured enemy leaders. It was a story of power, designed to leave no visitor, whether a loyal subject or a foreign ambassador, in any doubt about the price of defying Assyria. Yet, this brutal imagery existed alongside incredible feats of civic engineering and luxury. Sennacherib's, in particular, was a master builder who transformed his capital. To bring water to the city and its magnificent parks, he constructed one of the world's first great aqueducts, a limestone structure that carried water for over 30 miles from the mountains. He created vast, lush gardens filled with exotic plants and animals collected from every corner of his empire, a man-made paradise built in the heart of his military fortress. This sophisticated engineering was matched by an equally sophisticated administration. The vast empire was held together by an efficient network of royal roads, with relay stations where messengers on horseback could switch to fresh mounts, allowing decrees and intelligence reports to travel between the capital and the most distant provinces with incredible speed. But the Assyrians' most effective and most infamous tool of imperial control was the policy of mass deportation. After conquering a rebellious kingdom, they would systematically uproot tens of thousands of its people, particularly the wealthy and educated elites, and forcibly resettle them in a different, distant part of the empire. This brutal practice served two purposes. It shattered the national identity of conquered peoples, making future rebellions less likely, and it allowed the Assyrians to move skilled laborers and craftsmen wherever they were needed most. It was a cruel but ruthlessly effective method of social engineering. Perhaps the greatest paradox of this militaristic society can be found in the life of its last great king, Ashurbanipal. He was, like all his predecessors, a ruthless warrior and a boastful conqueror. But he was also a passionate scholar and collector. In his palace at Nineveh, Ashurbanipal created the world's first great, systematically collected and cataloged library. He was obsessed with the idea of preserving the sum of all knowledge. He sent scribes to every corner of Mesopotamia, especially to the ancient cities of Babylonia, with instructions to find and copy every important text they could get their hands on: religious hymns, medical treatises, collections of omens, astronomical observations, and most importantly, the ancient works of literature. It is thanks to the scholarly ambition of this Assyrian king that we now possess the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The clay tablets discovered by archaeologists in the ruined chambers of his library in the 19th century are the reason this ancient story can still be read today. It is a profound irony of history that the world's most brutal empire was also the world's greatest conservator, the iron fist that carefully preserved the soul of the very civilization it had conquered. The magnificent, brutal, and scholarly empire of the Assyrians, which had dominated the world for 3 centuries, seemed like an eternal and unshakable fact of life. Its armies were invincible, its administration was ruthlessly efficient, and its capital at Nineveh was a fortress of unimaginable strength. But an empire built on a foundation of pure terror is an inherently unstable thing. It rests upon a vast hidden reservoir of hatred. For generations, the conquered peoples of the empire, the Babylonians, the Elamites, the Egyptians, the Israelites, had suffered under the Assyrian yoke, paying crushing tribute and seeing their people led away into exile. They did not see the Assyrians as legitimate rulers. They saw them as cruel and demonic oppressors. They were all waiting quietly and patiently for a moment of weakness, for a chance to exact a terrible revenge. That moment came after the death of the last great king, the scholar warrior Ashurbanipal. His successors were lesser men, and they soon plunged the empire into a disastrous civil war, fighting amongst themselves for control of the throne. The mighty Assyrian army, the guarantor of imperial stability, was suddenly busy fighting itself. The heart of the empire was paralyzed by internal conflict, and its borders were left dangerously exposed. The reservoir of hatred began to overflow. From the south, in the ancient heartland of Babylonia, a new leader emerged. He was a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar. Seizing the opportunity presented by the Assyrian civil war, he captured the city of Babylon, declared himself its king, and announced his independence. This act lit the fire of a full-scale rebellion across the south. At the same time, a new and powerful threat coalesced on Assyria's eastern frontier. The Medes, an Iranian people who lived in the mountains, had long been subjugated and harassed by the Assyrians. But now, under a strong king named Cyaxares, they had united into a formidable kingdom, hungry for both independence and vengeance. The two rising powers Nabopolassar of Babylon and Cyaxares of the Medes saw their common enemy and formed a military alliance. For the first time, Assyria faced a coordinated two-front war at the very moment it was at its weakest. The coalition of vengeance began its march. In 614 BCE, the Median army stormed and sacked the city of Ashur, the ancient religious and spiritual center of the Assyrian nation. It was a devastating blow, both militarily and psychologically. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, the combined armies of the Medes and the Babylonians reached their ultimate prize, the vast, supposedly impregnable capital city of Nineveh. What followed was one of the most famous and catastrophic sieges in ancient history. The great city, which had orchestrated the destruction of so many others, now found itself surrounded by a vast army bent on its total annihilation. After a siege of 3 months, the walls were breached, and the allied armies poured into the city. The end was not a simple conquest. It was a premeditated and systematic act of destruction. The vengeful soldiers, unleashed after centuries of pent-up hatred, showed no mercy. They slaughtered the inhabitants, looted the immense treasures of the palaces and temples, and then they set the entire city ablaze. The magnificent palace without rival, with its miles of carved stone reliefs, was consumed by a fire so intense that it baked the clay tablets in Ashurbanipal's library, paradoxically preserving them for the future. The destruction was absolute. The fall of Nineveh was so sudden and so complete that it sent shockwaves across the ancient world, an event recorded in the Old Testament in the fiery prophecies of the prophet Nahum, who exulted in the city's destruction. The conquerors were not content to just defeat Assyria. They wanted to erase it from memory. The ruin of Nineveh was so complete that the city was abandoned, and its location was eventually forgotten for more than 2,000 years, buried under a mound of earth until 19th century archaeologists uncovered its remains. The central mystery of the Assyrian collapse is its sheer speed and finality. One moment, it was the undisputed superpower of the world. A few years later, it was gone, its great cities turned to ash heaps, and its people scattered. No other great empire in history has ever been so utterly and permanently destroyed. It was the perfect storm, a bitter civil war, a powerful two-front attack, and most importantly, the explosive force of accumulated hatred from its subjects. The Assyrians had spent centuries perfecting the art of war and terror. In the end, their own dark arts were turned against them, and their mighty empire vanished from the world in a cloud of fire and dust. With the Assyrian menace reduced to smoldering ruins, the victors divided the spoils. The Medes consolidated their control over the highlands of Iran and eastern Anatolia, while their allies, the Babylonians, claimed the greatest prize of all, the rich, ancient, now liberated heartland of Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar, the king who had freed Babylon, had established a new dynasty and a new empire known to history as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His reign was largely spent mopping up the last remnants of Assyrian resistance and securing the borders of his new state. But it was his son who would inherit this newfound power and use it to launch a final, spectacular golden age for Mesopotamian civilization. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II, and he would become the most powerful and famous king of this new era. Nebuchadnezzar was a brilliant military commander, securing and expanding the borders of his empire to encompass the entire Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. But his true passion, his life's great obsession, was not conquest, but construction. He was driven by a powerful dream to rebuild the city of Babylon on such a scale and with such magnificence that it would be hailed as the undisputed center of the world, a city so beautiful and so strong that it would erase the memory of all past humiliations and stand for eternity. He poured the immense wealth of his empire, the tribute from Syria, the trade from Phoenicia, the agricultural bounty of his own land, into a decades-long building project that would transform Babylon into one of the wonders of the ancient world. To approach Babylon in the age of Nebuchadnezzar was to be struck with a sense of awe. The city was protected by a legendary system of double walls, the outer rampart so colossal that the Greek historian Herodotus later claimed a 4-horse chariot could be driven along the top. This was a city designed to be unconquerable. The main entrance into the sacred heart of the city was the monumental Ishtar Gate. Unlike the stone and mud brick of past ages, this entire structure was covered in thousands of brilliant, cobalt blue glazed bricks that shimmered in the Mesopotamian sun. The gate was adorned with mesmerizing rows of raised relief animals sacred to the gods. Golden-maned lions, the symbol of the goddess Ishtar, marched alongside fierce-looking dragons, the symbol of the city's patron god, Marduk, and strong bulls, the symbol of the storm god Akkad. Passing through this dazzling gateway, a visitor would find themselves on the grand processional way, a wide avenue paved with stone and flanked by high walls decorated with over 100 more of the blue-glazed lions. This was the sacred road used for the great religious festivals, where the statues of the gods were paraded through the city for all to see. The way led to the city's religious center, a vast sacred precinct that housed the temple of Marduk, and next to it, the great ziggurat, a Temenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth. Nebuchadnezzar had rebuilt this ancient structure to a staggering height of possibly 300 feet, a 7-tiered artificial mountain of baked brick that dominated the skyline. It was this very tower, the largest ziggurat ever built, that was almost certainly the inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, a memory of a real Mesopotamian structure so tall that it seemed to be reaching for the heavens. But Nebuchadnezzar's city was more than just a fortress and a religious center. It was also a hub of science and learning. From the tops of these ziggurats, generations of Babylonian astronomers, known as the Chaldeans, meticulously observed and recorded the movements of the stars and planets. They developed a sophisticated mathematical astronomy, capable of predicting lunar and solar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They divided the sky into constellations, creating the concepts that would eventually evolve into the zodiac, and they were the ones who first divided the circle into 360 degrees. Much of the foundation of Western astronomy can be traced back to the patient sky-watching of these Babylonian priests. Yet, there is a darker side to this golden age. To fund these projects and secure his empire, Nebuchadnezzar was a ruthless conqueror. His most famous campaign, immortalized in the Old Testament, was his subjugation of the small kingdom of Judah. In 587 BCE, after a series of rebellions, his army conquered Jerusalem, destroyed its sacred temple, and carried off its king and a large portion of its population, the scribes, the priests, the artisans, into exile in Babylon. This event, the Babylonian captivity, was a profound national trauma for the Jewish people, but it also became a period of intense religious reflection that shaped the future of their faith. This has left us with a dual portrait of the great king. His own royal inscriptions speak almost exclusively of his pious building works, casting him as a humble servant of the gods. The historical and biblical records, however, remember him as a mighty and arrogant conqueror, the destroyer of nations. The truth is that he was both. In the ancient world, the wealth plundered from conquest was the fuel for the glorious acts of construction that were seen as a king's highest religious duty. Among all the verifiable, excavated, and well-documented wonders of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, the colossal walls, the brilliant blue of the Ishtar Gate, the sky-scraping ziggurat, there is one that is more famous than all the others combined, yet it remains a ghost, a beautiful rumor whispered down through the centuries. It is the only one of the traditional 7 wonders of the ancient world whose very existence is a matter of intense historical debate, the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The story as it has come down to us, not from Babylonian records, but from later Greek and Roman writers, is the stuff of pure romance. They wrote that the great king Nebuchadnezzar had a wife, a Midas, who came from the green and mountainous land of Media. Living in the flat, sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, she grew homesick for the lush, wooded hills of her youth. And so, to cure her sorrow, the king commanded the creation of an astonishing gift, a man-made mountain of gardens in the heart of the city. The descriptions are breathtaking. They paint a picture of a series of broad, stone terraces, rising one on top of the other, like the tiers of a ziggurat or a grand outdoor theater. Each terrace was said to be filled with a deep layer of soil, deep enough to support not just flowers and shrubs, but large, mature trees. From a distance, the entire structure would have appeared as a vibrant, green mountain, covered in a cascade of willows, date palms, and fragrant blossoms, seemingly floating in the air above the bustling city. It would have been an oasis of shade and tranquility, a stunning defiance of the harsh desert environment. The engineering required for such a project would have been nothing short of miraculous. To support the immense weight of the soil, the trees, and the water, the stone terraces would have needed to be incredibly strong. And to prevent the water from the constant irrigation from seeping through and destroying the mud brick foundations of the structure, the ancient writers describe a complex system of waterproofing with layers of woven reeds, thick bitumen, and even sheets of lead to line the flower beds. But the greatest challenge of all would have been the irrigation. How do you get a constant supply of water to the very top of a 75-foot-high structure, day in and day out, under the blazing Babylonian sun? The writers describe a sophisticated machine, perhaps a chain pump with buckets or a bronze water screw, hidden from view inside the structure, and worked continuously by teams of slaves, lifting water from a well or directly from the Euphrates River to the highest terrace, from which it could then flow down in gentle streams and waterfalls to nourish the levels below. It is a beautiful story, a monument born not of war or piety, but of love. And yet, it is a story that is wrapped in a profound and unsettling silence. Despite the fact that archaeologists have extensively excavated the ruins of Babylon, they have found no definitive archaeological evidence that matches the descriptions of the gardens. There is no ruin, no foundation, no part of the city that can be confidently identified as this world-famous wonder. Even more damning is the silence of the texts. We have thousands of cuneiform tablets from Nebuchadnezzar's reign, many of which are detailed royal inscriptions in which he boasts at great length about his magnificent building projects. He describes the restoration of the temples, the construction of the Ishtar Gate, and the raising of the great walls, often in meticulous detail. But in all of these texts, there is not a single, solitary mention of a great terraced garden, a structure that would have been his most unique and challenging creation. This has led historians to a number of competing theories. Perhaps the gardens did exist, but they were destroyed so completely by later conquerors or by the shifting course of the Euphrates that no trace of them remains. Or perhaps the story is simply a legend, a romantic exaggeration that grew over the centuries, with Greek writers who had never seen Babylon combining fanciful travelers' tales into a myth of a fairy tale wonder. But there is a third and much more intriguing possibility. What if the Hanging Gardens were real, but they were not in Babylon at all? One scholar, Dr. Stephanie Daly, has put forward a compelling case that the legend of the Hanging Gardens is actually a misplaced memory of a real garden, built a century earlier and hundreds of miles to the north in the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The evidence is tantalizing. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, unlike Nebuchadnezzar, boasted extensively in his inscriptions about the creation of a magnificent palace garden, a terraced wonder for all peoples. He describes his joy in collecting and planting exotic trees and plants from across his empire. He details his use of sophisticated engineering, including a great aqueduct and the use of a new device, a bronze water screw, to raise the water high. The carved reliefs from his palace even depict a lush, terraced garden planted with trees. It is possible that later Greek historians, looking back at the now ruined cities of Mesopotamia, simply confused the two great capitals and mistakenly attributed the Assyrian garden to the more famous Babylonian king. And so, the mystery endures, a sleepy historical puzzle. Was it a beautiful, romantic myth? Or was it a genuine wonder of the world, built not by Nebuchadnezzar for his wife in Babylon, but by his ruthless predecessor, Sennacherib, in the heart of the Assyrian Empire? The Golden Age brought by Nebuchadnezzar, like all golden ages, was fleeting. His dynasty did not long outlive him. His successors were a string of weak and ineffectual rulers, and the magnificent empire he had built began to decay from within, plagued by political instability and palace coups. The final native king to rule in Mesopotamia was a strange and controversial figure named Nabonidus. He was not from the main royal line and came to the throne under murky circumstances. He was an antiquarian and a religious reformer, but his reforms would prove to be his undoing. The king became obsessed with the worship of the moon god, Sin, whose main temple was in the northern city of Haran, where Nabonidus's mother had been a priestess. He began to elevate Sin above all other gods, including Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. This was a catastrophic political error. It alienated the powerful, wealthy, and deeply entrenched priesthood of Marduk, the most influential group in the capital, turning the city's religious establishment against its own king. Adding to the mystery, Nabonidus then did something utterly bizarre. For a full decade of his 17-year reign, he abandoned his capital city entirely. He took his court and a large part of the army and went to live in the remote desert oasis of Tama in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in Babylon as regent. His reasons for this long, self-imposed exile are one of the great unsolved puzzles of Mesopotamian history. But whatever the cause, his absence created a power vacuum at the center of the empire and fostered a deep resentment among his people. The Great New Year's Festival, the most important religious event in Babylon, which required the king's presence, could not be celebrated for 10 years. To the Babylonians, it felt as though their king had abandoned them, and their god, Marduk, had been forsaken. While Babylon was slowly rotting from the inside, a new, vibrant, and world-shaking power was rising to its east. From the highlands of Iran, the land of the Medes, came a new dynasty, the Persians. And their king was a man who would change the very definition of what it meant to be a conqueror. His name was Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was a political and military genius of the first order. He first united the Persian and Median peoples under his own rule, and then swept west, conquering the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia in modern-day Turkey. In just a few decades, he had forged a vast empire, the largest the world had ever known. And now, he turned his sights on the richest prize of all, the decadent, internally divided kingdom of Babylon. The end came in the year 539 BCE, and it was not the bloody, heroic siege that one might expect for the world's greatest city. It was a masterpiece of propaganda and psychological warfare. Long before his army ever reached the city walls, Cyrus's agents were at work inside Babylon. They spread messages and proclamations that painted Cyrus not as a destructive foreign invader, but as a righteous liberator, a champion chosen by the great god Marduk himself to save his city from the neglectful and heretical king Nabonidus. The discontented priests of Marduk, alienated by Nabonidus's religious policies, were all too happy to collaborate. When the Persian army finally arrived, the great unconquerable city, with its colossal double walls, simply gave up. According to the historical records, including a remarkable clay document known as the Cyrus Cylinder, the Persian forces entered the city without a battle. The gates were likely opened from the inside by collaborators. The last Babylonian army was defeated with ease, and the city surrendered peacefully. The great Babylonian Empire, which had risen from the ashes of Assyria in a blaze of glory, had come to an end not with a bang, but with a whisper. What happened next was revolutionary. The world was used to the Assyrian model of conquest, mass slaughter, deportation, and the looting of temples. Cyrus did the opposite. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He entered the city in peace, paid his respects at the temple of Marduk, and declared himself the legitimate successor to the ancient line of Mesopotamian kings. On his famous cylinder, he boasts not of his military victories, but of his piety, claiming he restored the temples and allowed peoples who had been deported to Babylon by previous kings to return to their homes. This policy had a momentous consequence that would echo through history. Among the exiled peoples living in Babylon were the Jews, who had been forcibly brought there by Nebuchadnezzar nearly 50 years earlier. True to his word, Cyrus freed them, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and giving them funds to rebuild their sacred temple. This act of benevolent statecraft earned him a unique and honored place in the Bible, where the Persian king is hailed as a divinely appointed savior. The fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great marks the end of an era. It was the definitive end of Mesopotamian self-rule. For the next 2.5 millennia, the land between the rivers would be a province of other, larger empires: the Persians, the Greeks of Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Arabs, and the Ottomans. The long, extraordinary story of the world's first civilization, a story begun thousands of years earlier in the reed huts of Sumer, had finally come to its quiet and peaceful end. And so, the long, independent story of the land between the rivers comes to a quiet close. The fall of Babylon to the Persians was not a fiery apocalypse, but a gentle transfer of power, the absorptions of one ancient world into a newer, larger one. For the next 2,000 years, the great cities of Mesopotamia would crumble, their mud brick walls slowly dissolving back into the dusty plains from which they were raised. The rivers would shift their course, and the desert sands would drift over the ziggurats and palaces, burying this entire civilization under silent, sleeping hills. The cuneiform script, once the language of kings and astronomers, fell out of use, its secrets lost, its wedge-shaped whispers silenced for millennia. It seemed as though the world's first civilization had simply vanished, but it had not. A civilization is more than just its cities and its kings. It is a collection of ideas. And the ideas born in ancient Mesopotamia had already escaped, spreading far and wide, embedding themselves so deeply into the foundations of other cultures that they became part of the very fabric of our world. They are the quiet, invisible echoes of that first great experiment in human community, legacies that we still live with every single day, often without ever realizing their ancient origins. Think for a moment of the way you measure the passage of your own day. The fact that you count 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour is a direct, unbroken inheritance from the Sumerians and their sexagesimal or base 60 counting system. The 24 hours that make up our day, the very concept of a 7-day week, and the 360 degrees that make up a circle, all of these are mathematical ghosts from ancient Mesopotamia, ideas that were passed on to the Greeks and Romans, and then down to us. When you look at the night sky, you are looking through a Babylonian lens. Their patient priest astronomers were the first to map the heavens, to identify the planets, and to chart the path of the sun through the 12 constellations of the zodiac. Their science, a blend of meticulous observation and mythological belief, was the wellspring from which all of Western astronomy would later flow. The legacy is there in our most foundational stories. The tale of a great, world-destroying flood and a single pious man who survives in a giant boat. The story of a baby set adrift in a reed basket to be found by a new family. The very idea of a paradise-like garden at the dawn of time. These are all narratives first written down on clay tablets in Mesopotamia, archetypes that have echoed through the literature and religion of countless cultures. The very act of writing down a story, of preserving thought in physical form, began in the temple storerooms of Uruk, when a society writes down its laws, placing the power of the state under a written public standard to protect the weak from the strong. It is following a precedent set by Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi. And the very world you live in, a world of cities, of dense urban centers with specialized workers, public buildings, and complex administrative systems, is a world built on the blueprint first drafted in the sprawling, chaotic, and vibrant streets of ancient Uruk. The wheel that turns on the road, the plow that turns the soil, the beer that is shared among friends, all have their deepest roots here in the land between the rivers. The story of this ancient civilization is a humbling one. It is a reminder that nothing, not even the mightiest empire, lasts forever. But it is also a story of incredible resilience and breathtaking creativity. It is the story of the first tentative steps from the village to the metropolis, from memory to the written word, from superstition to science, from vengeance to law. As you drift now into sleep, perhaps you can imagine the quiet dust of Iraq settling over the sleeping ruins of Ur and Nineveh and Babylon, and perhaps you can feel a sense of connection, a quiet gratitude for these distant, anonymous ancestors whose brilliant solutions to the problems of their time have become such a deep and inseparable part of our own. Their world is gone, but its echoes are all around us, in the ticking of a clock, in the turning of a page, and in the quiet patterns of the stars.